Since we're nearing the end of June, I thought it was time for another version of my Dynasty spin on Guy Fieri's Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives to scour through the ugly parts of Dynasty ADP and find those hidden gems among the muck. This episode will be focused more on players that I want to be trading for right now, either as throw-ins and deals or with my future thirds and fourths. So with that being said, welcome into episode 3 of Dynasty Fallers, Fill-ins, and Flyers. First up, we have our faller, which is really sad where we are given his extraordinary career. But since June 2020 to June 2022, no player has lost more Dynasty value than Julio Jones, who was a third-round asset just 2 years ago, now barely being drafted inside the top 250. And rightfully so. I mean, if any other 33-year-old receiver was coming off of 2 injury-riddled seasons with a combined 1,100 yards and 4 touchdowns, they probably wouldn't even be drafted right now or even on Dynasty rosters. So like I said, the problem with Julio the last 2 years has been injuries. And as he's getting older and older, those are harder to come back from. But when he does play, more often than not, he's going to be a good fantasy producer for you. And in fact, over the last 2 years, he's averaging 15.1 points per game when he plays at least 60% of the snaps. That number increases to over 16 points per game when he plays at least 75% of the snaps. Granted, some of that is being propped up by the beginning of 2020 with the Atlanta Falcons, but we knew that Tennessee wasn't going to be a better situation than what he had in Atlanta with Matt Ryan. Still, though, he averaged almost 13 points per game last year with the Titans when he played on 60% or more of the snaps, which are still mid-wide receiver 3 numbers. So what all of that is telling me is that Julio still has it, or at least has enough of it to still produce well for fantasy football. He may not be the Julio Jones from like 2016, but a 33-year-old Julio is still better than a lot of receivers in the league right now, even for fantasy football. At least at the time of recording this, he is still a free agent, but he's probably the best free agent receiver out there that a team would make him a priority this summer if injuries pop up or just overall depth is suspect. Ideally, I would love for him to go to Green Bay, where I think he'd immediately be the wide receiver 1 on the team, or possibly, and even more commonly rumored, is him going to the Indianapolis Colts, reuniting with Matt Ryan, coaching up Alec Pierce, and then he wouldn't even have to be the main focus of the offense as well. I also think that a dark horse team could be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers just for sheer depth, and they wouldn't have to pressure Chris Godwin to coming back all too quickly and potentially re-injuring or having another injury because of his ACL. I'm not paying much of anything for the shot on Julio landing somewhere fun though, and the DLF Trade Analyzer says that you don't have to. A 2024 third-round pick, a 2023 fifth-round pick, a couple fourth-rounders, maybe even offer like 50% of your fab if you can even trade that. And these are all trades that I would love to do just to see what happens with Julio in 2022. And maybe at the end of the day, be thankful that I have someone that I can somewhat be confident in starting in when it comes to those bye weeks or even injuries later in the fantasy season. Next up, we have our fill-in, and we have somebody that seems to be everybody's like favorite late round receiver all of a sudden, but is still drafted at wide receiver 65 in June DLF ADP, and that's Buccaneers wide receiver Russell Gage. We got a bit of news earlier this week on the Bucs from NFL Fantasy's Michael Florio talking with a Bucs beat reporter, and out of the many players that they talked about, he mentioned his belief that the Bucs could take their time with Chris Godwin returning from injury to make sure that he's comfortable not just as a receiver, but also as a blocker in that offense. He mentioned timelines of possibly return in November, maybe even December this year, which is at least half, if not more, of the season, like 75+% of the season. So if we assume that Godwin misses 10 games this year and Gage is their wide receiver 2 with Mike Evans, without Rob Gronkowski now, catching passes from Tom Brady, where would Gage rank among receivers in those 10 weeks? I can tell you right now that both Godwin and Evans were wide receiver 1s over the first 10 weeks last year, and that's including the 5 games where Antonio Brown played while averaging 19 fantasy points per game. Then you combine that with the fact that after Calvin Ridley left the Falcons last year, Gage averaged 16 fantasy points per game and was the wide receiver 10 from weeks 11 through 18. So what we have is a player that should comfortably be an every week fantasy starter, dare I say even a stud starter for half the season, maybe even more, going at wide receiver 65 prices in startups right now. To me, people just aren't aware of the upside that Gage presents so long as Chris Godwin is on the sideline. That's the only explanation for this current price. And don't even get me started on his most recent trades in the trade finder, like Robbie Anderson and the 311, Carson Wentz in a one quarterback league, DJ Chark straight up. These are easy prices to pay for a receiver that you might consider starting on bye weeks or with injuries just because of the offense he's in, let alone a potential wide receiver one that you're starting every single week for over half the year. So there's really not much more I can even say here, honestly, except go buy Russell Gage right now. Well, I mean, finish this video first, but then go buy Russell Gage today, right now. Lastly, we have our flyer, who I honestly wanted to put as our fill-in, but I just had to talk about Gage. So this player got pushed to the flyer position, and to tell you the truth, this guy is way more than a flyer. I mean, he's been a great fantasy option when he gets to be the starter, but I'm going to take it one step further and go as far as saying that I think Darrell Williams is a deep flyer option to be a league-winning running back relative to his cost. And I mean, I'm talking James Robinson, Mike Davis, Elijah Mitchell, pick this guy up off your waivers and redraft leagues type of league-winning running back. Ever since he signed with the Arizona Cardinals, I haven't really seen any fluctuation in Williams' price, and I have no idea why. He was the RB20 last year in a committee backfield with Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Jerick McKinnon, but he had over 1,000 total yards and 8 total touchdowns. Now, he's on the Cardinals, and my assumption is that people are just too infatuated with James Conner and what he did last year that they just forget all the reasons that we hated him in the first place heading into last year, which means he's injury prone, he's constantly missing games, he isn't really a PPR back to say the least, and those are all still true heading into 2022. And while I'm proud to say that I hit on Conner last year, there are still red flags that I see. Like, he had the worst yards per carry of his career last year, his lowest targets and receptions per game of his career last year. And his best games came when Chase Edmonds was not on the field, averaging 9 points per game more without Edmonds than with him. What he did do was just play the most games in a season that he's ever played and scored a lot of touchdowns, a career high in touchdowns, 18 to be exact. But I think that we forget how this backfield worked when Edmonds was healthy, because that was the first half of the season, and we really only remember the second half when James Conner really went off, because through weeks 1 through 8, Edmonds was the RB16 in fantasy, and James Conner was the RB21. Conner had 20 more rush attempts and 7 more touchdowns, but Edmonds survived because of his receiving work. In fact, Edmonds' season stat line in 12 games is really close to Williams' stat line over 17 games on the Kansas City Chiefs, minus a handful of touchdowns that just were all going to James Conner. I don't think the Cardinals want Conner to be the guy 100%, and I think what we have here is just like a lighter version of the Packers backfield, where we have a wear and tear bruiser partnering with a slashier pass catcher who both receive similar total volume at the end of the day. If that's the case, Williams is already a value at his RB59 prices in Dynasty, but what would happen if Conner can't stay healthy like he's shown in the past and really not be able to? Well, we had 2 games last year where Conner was hurt and Edmonds was the guy, and in those 2 games, Edmonds averaged 25 opportunities and finished as the RB6 and RB26. That also fits really well with the games where we saw last year where Clyde Edwards-Helaire missed and Darrell Williams was the guy, where he averaged 18 opportunities and 17.5 fantasy points per game. So are you starting to see why I love Darrell Williams and think that he has an outside chance of being a league-winning running back if Conner were to miss any significant time in 2022? And again, his dynasty price is just 3rd and 4th round picks. I mean, they're just easy moves to make right now for a running back that could quadruple in value easily. You don't even have to use him. Like, if you're rebuilding, buy for a 3rd right now, or maybe even a couple 4ths, and then sell for a 2nd in season to a contender when James Conner gets hurt. That's just free dynasty money right there. Then while you're on a trading spree from this video, you can also watch this one right here on 2 player combinations that I would recommend tearing down from right now.